What if I told you that in the heart of medieval Europe lived a noblewoman so twisted, so elegantly inhumane, that during a great famine she demanded the peasants serve their own children as food, and they obeyed? This is not Gothic fiction, it is blood-soaked truth buried beneath the crumbling pages of forgotten chronicles. Her name was the Countess of Wallachia, and her castle was a monument to refined cruelty amid the starving screams of a dying land. Wallachia, a place of forest wolves and whispered curses nestled between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River. It was a principality often lost between empires and forgotten by mercy. In the early 15th century, famine swept its valleys like a plague on horseback. Crops failed, cattle bones lay scattered like dice thrown by death. And as villagers clawed at frozen earth for roots, the Countess planned a feast unlike any the world had seen. She was born into one of the region's oldest noble families, a lineage so obsessed with purity that they intermarried until madness ran like blood in their veins. From youth, she was taught that suffering purified the soul, but hers had already been devoured by shadows. Pale, composed, and terrifyingly articulate, she ruled from a stone fortress, perched above a valley of withered crops and hollow-eyed peasants. She believed famine was a divine tool. When the famine peaked, starving families begged at her gates. She welcomed them not with bread, but with rules. For every portion of grain, she demanded a sacrifice, one child per family. At first, the villagers thought she meant labor. They were wrong. The first cauldron was served steaming at a banquet for traveling nobles, offered as meat blessed by necessity. The guests praised its tenderness. At first, no one asked what it was. One night, a mother recognized her daughter's necklace left among the folds of a roasted stew. She screamed, but the Countess merely raised a goblet and said, "In this world, there is no place for the weak." That phrase became law in her land. She turned famine into selection. Those willing to give could live. Those who refused disappeared. Their homes burned, their names scraped from church walls. Rumors spread quickly, but fear spread faster. The local clergy, horrified, demanded intervention. The Countess responded with an invitation to dinner. One priest, trembling but brave, accepted. He blessed the meal, tasted the meat, and by the night's end wept like a child. He was never seen again, though his rosary was later found tucked beneath a dinner plate shaped like a lamb. Winter fell hard. Snow blanketed the land but could not muffle the screams. The villagers, emaciated and trembling, stopped praying for salvation. They began praying for oblivion, yet the Countess's castle glowed with candlelight. Inside, music played, dancers spun, laughter echoed over the cries outside. Wealthy lords and ladies from distant provinces visited, eager to taste the forbidden and witness the cruelty of a woman who turned famine into ritual. The kitchen became a sanctuary of horrors. Her cooks, many orphans or slaves, prepared each dish in silence. The meat was washed, sliced, and presented with wine from Hungarian vineyards. The Countess demanded elegance, even in atrocity. No screams were allowed to echo in the dining hall, only smiles, silverware, and obedience. Her maids whispered prayers while seasoning, her stewards wept softly while serving. Then came the gathering, a twisted yearly event born from religious harvest festivals. Every family was required to present an offering of youth. Some brought their dead, others, the living, most brought silence and bowed heads. The Countess, standing above them like a statue, nodded approval as mothers laid infants in silk-lined baskets. From sacrifice, she proclaimed, "Strength will rise." Through it all, her expression never changed, cold, unreadable porcelain. She believed she was doing God's work, that by culling the herd, she was saving Wallachia's essence. Historians would later argue she was mad, but if you read the surviving letters, the chilling accounts of wandering monks and escaped servants, you'll find something worse than madness purpose. In the village of Guranagra, once meaning black throat, an old woman named Anka began carving marks into a birch tree, one for each child taken by the Countess. By the second winter, the tree was no longer white. It wore a mourning gown of lines, crosses, and broken prayers. People no longer grieved aloud. Mourning had become as dangerous as disobedience. And still she reigned. She dressed in black velvet gowns laced with crimson threads as if sewn with dried veins. Her dogs, massive Transylvanian mastiffs, were better fed than her subjects. It's said she watched them devour seasoned meat beside her throne, then turned to her steward and whispered, "See, even the beasts know gratitude." A strange transformation took hold of the village. Morality warped, famine twisted instincts. Parents began offering their weakest children not out of cruelty, but in hopes the stronger would live. What began as horror became ritual. What began as resistance became religion. And on that altar of absence, the Countess rose as high priestess of human despair. A boy named Calin escaped barefoot and frostbitten into the forests after watching his sister carried off in a sack. He wandered for 2 days before collapsing at the monastery of St. Flora, where monks took him in. His tongue half frozen, he could barely speak, but what he whispered into the abbot's ear changed everything. The soup was screaming. The monastery sent a scribe and a brother knight to investigate, disguised as merchants seeking favor. The Countess welcomed them. She had nothing to hide, for no one believed the poor. During the banquet, the scribe noticed strange carvings on the silver bowls, symbols of containment borrowed from ancient Orthodox exorcisms. The Countess caught him staring. "They purify the flavor," she said, smiling. That night, the knight vanished. The scribe found only a stained apron and a bloodied carving knife under his guest bed. He fled before dawn, riding until his horse collapsed. Later, he published his diary in Prague under an anonymous name. It was banned within weeks, but not before rumors spread across Eastern Europe like fire through dry wheat. Nobles turned their backs. Letters from Vienna and Krakow arrived, warning the Countess to stop, but she feared no kings. She feared nothing. "They eat veal without asking which calf," she wrote in one of her letters, "yet scorn me for making famine functional." Her boldness was not madness. It was logic honed by hunger wrapped in silk. In spring, when the ice cracked and the earth softened, peasants found a buried chamber behind the stables. It held hundreds of bones, tiny bones arranged in perfect circles. Some still had red ribbons tied to them like gifts. The Countess claimed it was an ossuary to honor the dead. No one believed her. No one dared question her. Until the day of the fire. A girl named Mela, orphaned by winter and driven by rage, slipped into the castle at dusk. She carried only a lantern and a rusted blade. She found the kitchen empty, the fire still warm. In the pantry, she found rows of hanging meat, but no pigs, no lambs, no deer, just braids of hair, necklaces of baby teeth, and a jar labeled silence. She screamed, but the walls swallowed the sound. A maid found her and dragged her to the Countess, who looked at the trembling child and said, "You are brave, but bravery is not survival." Mela was not executed, she was made a servant. From that day, every pot she stirred whispered back in voices too familiar. The children who survived inside the castle changed. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not laugh. Their eyes no longer blinked in rhythm with the world. They moved like shadows through the halls, hands always clasped behind their backs, mouths always shut. Some say the Countess taught them that speaking invites memory, and memory invites madness. Once a month, the Countess held what she called a night of merit. Villagers were summoned to the courtyard. Those who had given the most children livestock tools could approach and receive a blessing, a slice of warm bread dipped in broth. The rest watched, hands empty as the bread vanished into trembling mouths. A lesson, she said, a sacred ritual of discipline. But in the silence, something stirred among the broken. A man named Josefa, once a teacher, began scratching messages inside barn doors. He wrote of resistance, of hidden grain of courage returning. His words were short and sharp, carved with broken nails stained with soot and blood. He became a ghost with a voice, a whisper in the night that said, "She can bleed." The Countess noticed, she always noticed, but instead of punishing the village, she staged a new game. She called it the test of faith. Each week, a family was chosen at random. One member was locked in a wooden cell with a bowl of food and a knife. The food was real. The catch, the knife was poisoned. If they ate, they lived. If they shared, both died. She called it an experiment in virtue. The villagers called it damnation. One day, a wandering minstrel arrived at the village gates. He was blind, dressed in rags, and claimed to bring news from the Pope. He sang of falling stars and rising beasts. The Countess invited him, curious. During his performance, he paused, tilted his head, and whispered toward her throne, "Not even you can eat your way out of judgment." She smiled. That night he vanished, but his lute remained, its strings snapped and soaked. As time passed, the seasons lost their names. Villagers no longer said spring or autumn. They said the season of flesh, the season of ashes. Language itself buckled under the weight of horror. Children born during the famine were never named. They were numbers whispered in code by mothers, afraid to love what could be taken. Then on a blood-orange dusk, smoke rose from the monastery of St. Flora. Bandits, it was said, had burned it, but some survivors whispered another story. The Countess ordered its destruction after the abbot declared her excommunicated. Her soldiers burned sacred texts, shattered relics, and nailed crucifixes upside down over the ruins. Faith, she said, is only as strong as its fire. Rumors reached Bucharest, but the rulers, distant and wrapped in their own wars, ignored them. Wallachia was a wild province, best left to its own madness, and the Countess paid her taxes. Gold, after all, shines brighter than screams. The silence of kings became her sanctuary. Yet within her own halls, cracks were forming. Servants began dropping plates, maids forgot prayers, dogs refused to enter certain rooms. One cook swore he saw a child's face in the soup blinking. Another hanged himself in the pantry, carving a single word into his arm: forgiveness. The Countess dismissed it all as hysteria, but even she began locking her doors at night. The castle had begun to whisper. Stones groaned, doors sighed, mirrors reflected rooms that did not exist. And in the depths of the kitchen, in a sealed crypt no one remembered building, there was a sound like breathing, but slower. She sent guards to investigate. They never returned. Only the echo came back, and the echo said her name. One night the Countess stood alone in her great hall, staring into a mirror that no longer reflected her face. Instead, it showed the courtyard filled with children, staring back silent, and still their eyes hollow as burned-out stars. She shattered the glass with a candelabra, but by morning the mirror was whole again, and the children were closer. Desperate to regain control, the Countess ordered a festival, not of flesh, not of merit, but of music. She summoned violinists, dancers, and acrobats from across the principality. The villagers were forced to attend. Wine flowed, fireworks burst, but no one smiled. The music sounded like wailing, the dancers moved like marionettes, and the Countess at the center spun endlessly until she collapsed, vomiting blood in the shape of a hand. That night she dreamed of a banquet where she was the main course. Her guests were faceless, their teeth gleaming like knives. She woke in a cold sweat, her sheets soaked with salt. Her maids found her sitting at the foot of her bed, eyes wide, whispering, "The silence is eating me." More servants fled. Horses were found dead, their tongues cut out. The well turned black. The orchard bore fruit shaped like limbs. A noble who visited claimed the wine tasted of tears. He never returned home. The Countess accused the village of witchcraft and had 10 elders hanged upside down in the square. Their bodies swayed in rhythm with a wind no one felt. In her final attempt to restore order, she summoned the last known witch from the marshes, a blind old woman named Baba Mila. "You've stirred the bones the crones set upon entering, and now they stir you." The Countess demanded protection. Baba Mila smiled, toothless and sad. "There is no protection," she said, "only payment." The Countess offered gold. Mila laughed. She offered blood. Mila shook her head. Finally, she asked, "What do you fear most?" The Countess paused, her voice broke, being forgotten. Mila nodded and said, "Then you will live forever in screams." That night the witch vanished, but the sound of whispering children echoed through the castle louder than ever. The villagers, now skeletal, half-mad, began digging graves for themselves. They no longer expected salvation, only an end. Yosefi, the teacher, was caught one night writing the words, "She is not death, she is hunger crowned." He was dragged before the Countess, who asked why he resisted. His reply, because someone must remember how to be human. Instead of executing him, she kept him alive, caged like a bird, forced to write praises of her every day. Pages and pages of lies. But he wrote one truth on his own skin, carved with a spoon. Hell is not fire, hell is watching and doing nothing. Eventually, even his screams stopped. The winter returned, but this time there was no flesh, no grain, no more children. Only silence and snow. The Countess wandered the halls, hallucinating faces in the frost. She tried to sing but forgot the words. She tried to pray but remembered no gods, only the taste, only the smell, and then nothing. The final day came quietly. The castle gate stood open, the courtyard empty. Her throne was bare. The villagers found her in the kitchen, seated by the fire, her hands submerged in a boiling cauldron. She was smiling. Her final words, spoken to no one, and everyone, were, "At last I am sated." They buried her without ceremony, without priests, without hymns, just cold hands and colder earth. The castle was sealed with chains, its doors bricked shut. The villagers left upside-down crosses at the gates, not as a curse, but as a warning. Do not open, do not enter, let her rot beneath her hunger. But she did not rot. Days later, when storms unearthed her grave, the body was gone. No footprints, no signs of animals, just an empty coffin lined with claw marks on the inside. Some said she had risen. Others believed she had never truly died. Either way, the castle remained silent but watchful. For decades, no one dared approach the ruins. The forest swallowed the path, maps erased the name, birds avoided the trees. But Wallachian children still whispered her name when campfires dimmed. And sometimes during famines, meat would appear mysteriously in the village square, warm wrapped in velvet. A century later, a team of foreign scholars came seeking the truth. They dug in the basement and found bones, hundreds of them arranged like prayers with tiny symbols carved into each femur. They found portraits with scratched-out eyes and a diary written in 3 languages no one had ever seen. They published nothing. The lead scholar returned home with a small token, a silver spoon from the Countess's kitchen. Weeks later, his wife vanished, then his son, then his dog. They say he was found one morning chewing his own hand, muttering, "She is still hungry." The spoon was gone. The case was never solved. The Countess of Wallachia became legend, then myth, then something more. Her story transformed, told in taverns, scratched on prison walls, whispered in soup kitchens. A warning, yes, but also a mirror. Because the true horror was not her cruelty. It was how quickly desperation made her cruelty possible. Centuries passed, wars came and went, kingdoms rose and fell. But in every famine-struck village, in every hungry eye, a flicker of her presence lingered. Not physical, not ghostly, but psychological. That deep question, what would you do to survive? And in that question, she lived. Recently, a researcher uncovered her original edicts signed by her hand. They were cold mathematical, written like accounting ledgers. 1 child, 2 weeks of grain. 1 sibling, 4 portions. No emotion, just numbers, just hunger. The researcher burned the papers afterward, said he heard crying in the ink. In the ruins of St. Flora's monastery, now reduced to moss and rubble, 1 wall still stands. Carved into the stone, faded by rain, and time is a single sentence. She wore hunger as a crown. Below it, a tiny footprint no larger than a child's. No one knows who made it. No one wants to know. And so we tell her story not to glorify, not to indulge, but to remember. Unchecked power becomes appetite, and unchecked appetite becomes legend. The Countess of Wallachia is not a ghost. She is a question, a silence, a mirror. And when the world forgets how quickly hunger twists the soul, she returns dressed in velvet, smiling. Centuries after her death, the Countess remains nameless in most official records. The church calls her the Devourer. Historians label her the Countess of Silence. But the people of Wallachia know the truth. In their lullabies, they still warn children not to cry at night, lest she hear, lest she feed. Her castle, though mostly in ruins, still stands. Ivy has claimed the walls, the gate is rusted. Yet tourists claim to hear the clink of silverware behind the stones, or smell soup in the air despite the wind. One visitor recorded laughter, soft, high-pitched, unmistakably inhuman. He erased the recording, but never erased the memory. Among the archives of lost noble houses, there is a strange family tree, the Drakalsti, the Basarab, and in the margin, Dravaga scratched out in red. No children, no heirs, no marriages, just a branch circled in ink, labeled fed by ashes. The ink looks wet even after centuries. In psychology, her name appears as an archetype, the Erzsébet complex, when controlled deprivation and isolation lead to moral collapse. Soldiers trapped in sieges, refugees in camps, survivors on lifeboats all echo her logic, whispering, "Better one dies than many. Better to eat than be eaten." A modern artist tried to recreate her dining room. She replicated every candle, every knife, every plate. But halfway through the installation, she stopped, claimed the walls began to weep. Her studio flooded with salt water. Now she paints only in white. When asked why, she said, "I've seen enough red." Even now, in times of crisis, political leaders reference the throne of hunger, a term born from the Countess's legend. It means to rule by fear, disguised as necessity to enforce survival through suffering, to look into the eyes of the starving and call it policy. In literature, her shadow reappears again and again, the cold woman, the velvet tyrant, the heartless hostess, but no one dares name her fully. To name her is to remember. To remember is to risk summoning the part of us that agreed with her, that nodded when she said, "This is the price of order." Because at its core, the horror is not just her existence. It is our reflection in her. She did not descend from monsters, she rose from people fed by permission, justified by hunger, adorned by wealth. She is what happens when systems choose efficiency over empathy, and once chosen, that path is not easily undone. So yes, the Countess of Wallachia was real, whether as woman monster or metaphor. She left her mark not just in bones, but in behaviors, in every equation that weighs life against need, in every policy that sacrifices the voiceless for the powerful, in every dining table too silent to be clean. And perhaps the scariest truth of all, she doesn't need to return, because we've kept her alive, not in body, not in castle, but in the choices we make when pressed, when hungry, when afraid. She is not history, she is prophecy. Years later, when famine struck another land far away, modern televised, a relief worker found a child clutching a diary. It was written in a language the worker didn't recognize, but the drawings were unmistakable. A throne of ribs, a woman without eyes, a bowl that never emptied. The child had never left her village yet. When asked who the lady was, she answered in perfect Wallachian. She watches those still hungry. In academia, some professors dare include her in lectures on forbidden philosophy. They present her logic as a thought experiment. What would you sacrifice to save the majority? But the classroom always grows cold, not from the air, but from the implication. Because the more you study her, the more you realize she didn't create cruelty. She clarified it. A theologian suggested the Countess was not evil, just efficient. She embodied unrestrained utilitarianism, he wrote, and in doing so showed that the line between civilization and savagery is not light, but food. He was fired the next year for quoting her writings in a public forum. The backlash was swift. The question remained. There are survivors, even now, descendants of those who lived through her reign. They don't tell bedtime stories, they plant trees, they speak kindly, they cook too much. Because deep in their blood, they remember the taste of what should not be eaten, and they refuse to let the silence return. A century from now, her story may resurface, not as horror, not as myth, but as precedent. In times of climate collapse, political upheaval, or digital dehumanization, her logic will grow seductive again, cold, clean, calculated. She offers not salvation, but order, not kindness, but clarity. That is her danger. That is her appeal. And so we must remember not to fear her, but to fear becoming her. To fear the moment we too begin to see sacrifice as strategy, when empathy feels inefficient, when we label hunger as weakness. That is when her footsteps echo loudest, not in the past, but in our choices, in the silent hours of winter nights by hearths or empty refrigerators. People still murmur her name, not aloud, but inwardly in shame and warning, in recognition. Because even if her castle crumbles, even if her bones remain scattered, the structure she built was never stone. It was made of choices, and those never die. They say in Wallachia, the wind still sings her tune, a lullaby without words, just hunger and harmony. Travelers claim that on certain nights the trees seem to lean inward, as if listening, as if waiting, as if remembering. Because the land itself was fed too long on fear to forget her. And if you find yourself alone, deciding between comfort and conscience, between silence and protest, between watching and acting, remember her not as a ghost, not as a monster, but as a mirror. Because she is what rises when compassion dies, what smiles when morality withers, what survives when humanity does not. So light your fires, share your bread, speak loudly, and never ever let your hunger choose for you. Because in every famine, literal or moral, there is a countess waiting, and she needs only a silence to feast again.